Good evening, y'all. My name is Cale Carter, and today we're going to be talking about the history of the 25th Infantry Regiment. Now, due to the fact there's a lot of information to cover regarding the 25th Infantry Regiment, the video will be broken down into two parts. Part 1 will focus on the 25th Infantry Regiment at the start of World War II up until when the 25th was deployed overseas. And Part 2 will focus on the 25th Infantry Regiment's history once it arrived overseas and up until the end of the war. So with all that being stated, let's go ahead and get started. The 25th Infantry Regiment, much like the 24th, which I covered in a previous video, and the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, which I'll cover in a later video, the 25th was among the most experienced black regiments within the U.S. Army on the eve of World War II. And that was because, like the regiments I previously mentioned, the 25th was in continual service with the U.S. Army since the end of the Civil War. So, prior to the outbreak of World War II, the 25th Infantry Regiment pretty much was stationed at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, and was stationed there pretty much since the end of World War I. Because previous to being stationed at Fort Huachuca, the 25th was initially stationed at Hawaii during World War I, but then was based at Fort Huachuca. Now, when World War II broke out, the U.S. Army, of course, had to be enlarged to prepare for fighting both like Nazi Germany in Europe as well as Imperial Japan in the Pacific. So the U.S. Army had to expand and basically increase its size and manpower to combat these threats. And among the requirements was that some of the divisions that would be created would have to be black or colored divisions to help expand the Army. And this is where the 25th Infantry comes into play. During 1942, the 25th Infantry Regiment, along with the 368th Infantry Regiment, which I will cover in a later video, of course, were used to form the basis of what would become known as the 93rd Infantry Division, which would ultimately become the first black combat division raised in World War II. Now, because of the fact that the 25th Infantry Regiment was one of the more experienced black regiments, the soldiers from that regiment were used to help build up the staff as well as the non-commissioned officer ranks of other black infantry not only black infantry but black regiments that would be not only a part of the 93rd but also would later be a part of the 92nd Infantry Division. Now, from 1942 to the eve of 1943, the 25th Infantry Regiment, along with the rest of the 93rd Infantry Division, pretty much spent its time in Fort Huachuca doing training and doing exercises, as well as helping with the creation of the other core units that would be a part of the 93rd and later the 92nd Infantry Divisions. However, there was a series of incidents that was occurring during this time period that would kind of build up to mark, shall we say, the 93rd Infantry Division both during and even after the war to an extent. Some of these incidents included clashes with white servicemen and MPs, primarily in the border towns that surrounded Fort Huachuca. You also had clashes with white officers, primarily with draftee personnel that came from both the northern states as well as areas where there wasn't such vile racism. Well, the racism was still vile, but it wasn't to the levels that was seen in the Jim Crow South. As well as another interesting incident that I'll be honest, when I first read about it, it was kind of shocking, but when you understand the historical context, it really wasn't. There was an incident in late 1942 where the then governor of Arizona, named Sidney Osborne, put in a request to the War Department for the use of soldiers to help bring in the cotton crops. Now, Cotton crops were essential to the war effort because they would be used to make clothes as well as parachutes and other thing that was essential to the war effort. Now, when the then governor petitioned the War Department, from the documentation that I've seen up to this point, it was kind of alluded to that the army personnel that should be used would be the 93rd, the soldiers based at Fort Huachuca, which at the time the largest contingent based at Fort Huachuca was the 93rd Infantry Division, including the 25th Infantry Regiment. Now, of course, we can see the issue that's building right now with this point. White governor has issues with bringing in a cotton crop, and he petitioned the War Department to use soldiers, and the soldiers he happened to refer to were soldiers that were based at Fort Huachuca, which happened to be predominantly black. Yeah, that's not really a good look. So what happened was that when the order came to the War Department, the way that the order would have been implemented, if it had to be implemented, would have been that both white soldiers and black soldiers that were not considered critical to the war effort, i.e. units that were in service and supply, like quartermasters, engineers, they would be used to help bring in the cotton crop, because infantry regiments and combat units took priority so they can go overseas and fight. Now, ultimately, what ended up happening too was that the black press and the black press at the time heard about or caught wind about what was happening. So what they did, they applied pressure to the War Department, saying, "Well, how dare you even think about basically applying this? How dare you think about using it? This is basically a case of vile racism." Ultimately, the proposition was dropped, but it basically kind of led to, as I would say before, and I would tell people, this actually led to another series of incidents that will occur that you can kind of say that would mark the 93rd as a hard luck outfit to a degree. So after, in early 1943, the 93rd and the 25th Infantry Regiment, along with the 93rd, was deployed to Louisiana. And they were deployed to the Louisiana Maneuver area, and the idea was that they would go there and do training against the 85th Infantry Division before, of course, deploying overseas. Now, the interesting thing about the 93rd as well, the 25th Infantry Regiment, along with the 93rd being deployed to Louisiana, while they were there conducting maneuvers, the division actually earned, the division as well as its individual units, earned high praise for their efficiency in handling battle drills and everything else. However, one of the main issues that continued to plague the unit was the fact that this was a black combat division stationed in the Jim Crow South. Now, keep in mind, most black units at the time that would get trained in the South were usually at most about a battalion size. Battalion, and in some cases regiment, which can range anywhere from about 1,000 to 3,000 soldiers. With the 93rd being deployed to Louisiana, this marked the first time that a division-sized black unit was deployed to the South during the war. So you had approximately 17,000 black soldiers, give or take, stationed in the Jim Crow South. So because of that, there was automatically concern from the white population about a 17,000 strong black unit that's trained for combat being stationed in the Jim Crow South. Now, of course, other incidences continue to occur, and such as you had cases where you had soldiers that were very upset about the Jim Crow South's law regarding moving to the back of the bus. But in addition to those incidences, you also had other clashes, such as white MPs harassing black soldiers, as well as the black women who were with the black soldiers. And keep in mind, during this time where they were stationed in Louisiana, you also had incidents occurring throughout the country involving black soldiers. You had the Camp Von Dorn incidents. You had incidences at Camp Stewart. You had all, in addition to incidences within the military, that were clashes between black soldiers and white servicemen, MPs, and even white locals. You also had a series of what would be considered what they call race riots, but really would be considered almost race massacres that occurred during this period. You had, of course, you had the race riots up in Detroit, and you also had race riots that occurred in Beaumont, Texas during this time period. Now, with the latter one, the case of the Beaumont race riot, it does lead to an interesting case that allegedly occurred with the 25th Infantry Regiment while they were deployed in Louisiana. Now, again, as I'm saying this allegedly because in terms of the sources, I'm still trying to find other primary sources to verify the story, but nonetheless, it does kind of illustrate the heightened tension that was occurring not only within the 25th Infantry Regiment or the 93rd Infantry Division, but heightened tensions that was being seen across the country regarding the issue of race within the military and the issues of race riots. So there was a story of a soldier called Corporal Joe Henry Johnson. He was from Company D of the 25th Infantry Regiment. And while he was at Fort Huachuca, he actually was proven to be a really good machine gunner. Like the story goes, he was a really good machine gunner. He actually won an award for it. And of course, when the division was sent to Louisiana for the maneuvers, he was actually not far from home. He was not far. The soldier was really from Beaumont, Texas, allegedly, and he was not far from home. And the story goes is that the soldiers got word of every race riot or clash that would occur, and he wanted to go home, but he couldn't. Either he was denied access to going home, or there was a lack of information coming out regarding what happened to his family. So allegedly, the story goes is that one day while they're doing maneuvers, he just lets loose with a machine gun aimed at unarmed white soldiers. Now, of course, ultimately he was punished for it. The question is that I still have to figure out, and that's why I still want to hopefully find out more about the story, is what exactly happened, and was this an actual story, or was this a story that was shrouded in myth? Because the only source we got for the story is a veteran from the 39th Infantry Regiment named Nelson Perry. But I digress. I kind of went a little bit off topic, but the point was that during this time period, there was a lot of clashes between both the soldiers, locals, as well as white officers, MPs, and even some internal clashes as well. So during this period, after the Louisiana maneuvers, the units in terms of combat drills, so they was rated with high praise, and they was rated as efficient. And at that point, the entire division, including the 25th, was sent to Camp Clipper, as well as other camps in the Mojave Desert in California. Now, the thing about the unit getting deployed to Camp Clipper and the other camps in the Mojave Desert, those areas were usually staging areas for soldiers that were getting sent to the European theater of operations. However, during this time frame, there was kind of a conflict within the U.S. government, within the higher echelons of the War Department, as well as kind of clashes between the War Department and the black press about the deployment of these black soldiers. I mean, the 93rd was a combat division, and at the time when they were deployed to Camp Clipper, this was 1943 going on the start of 1944. Now, of course, during that time period, you had the invasion of North Africa. You had the starting invasions of Italy. You had the beginnings of the offensive in the Pacific Theater. So it was kind of odd to the black press and some of the black press as well as black officials that given that there's all these major offensive operations occurring, how come the 93rd was still stateside? And one of the last things I want to bring up before I end this video, and it's one of the more interesting elements that also comes up with studying not only the 93rd and not only the 25th Infantry Regiment, but studying black regiments, black units as a whole in World War II. And that is this love-hate relationship with the black press. The reason why I bring that up is because, as I mentioned before, the black press on numerous occasions would advocate for the black soldiers. They advocated against them, against the War Department trying to use them as basically labor for picking cotton crops. There was cases where the black newspapers became the outlets for black soldiers being able to air their grievances about serving in the Jim Crow Army or their conditions. But at the same time, there was also some animosity regarding the way the black newspapers would do black soldiers. In the case of the 93rd, and the 25th and the 93rd by proxy, one of the issues that would come up was the fact that the black newspapers would say, well, we want these units deployed overseas. We want these guys to be deployed overseas so they can have their trial by combat. And in fact, one soldier illustrated it perfectly. He said, well, these people, in essence, want to shed my blood so that at the end of the war, those people who never fought in the war could say, well, see, we earned our tax and blood, therefore you should give us better positions than by us, meaning the elements of the black elite. Now, another interesting element of that subject as well is the fact that when the black newspapers came down to Louisiana, for example, to monitor the employment of the 93rd and during the Louisiana Maneuvers, one of the pet peeves that did come up with some soldiers as well was the fact that the black newspapers focused almost entirely on the 93rd, but did not focus on the horrible conditions that the black population in Louisiana lived in, and not really bringing that to widespread attention. But with all that said, prior to the 25th and the 93rd by proxy being deployed overseas, they already had a very eventful career stateside. Eventful and, shall we say, in some elements, controversial career stateside. Now, will this change when the 25th is deployed overseas? Well, we'll delve into that next time with part 2 of this video. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope y'all were able to learn something new that you may not have learned about before. Thank you, and good night, y'all.